hello everybody. Today we have a very special guest in order to discuss video game censorship, the history around it, kind of the interesting issues that it raises, and also in part the communities that have arisen in resistance to it, and the discussions that happen about it. So first of all, would you like to tell us who you are, a little bit about your channel, and what you do?
Hi, my name is Callum, and I am the co-host of Byte Marx, a podcast by gamers for gamers about politics. Emilio and I host the podcast just about monthly, where we release videos about games and politics and funky architecture sometimes, and occasionally we answer questions. You can find us on Twitter at the channel Byte Marx, and not Twitter, YouTube. And you can find us on Twitter, for realsies this time, at Byte Marx Cast. I've never done one of these videos before, so I'm a little nervous.
Oh no, I'm very nervous as well. But it's fine.
Emilio's usually the one who does these.
Alrighty. So first of all, censorship has been.
Oh wait. Before I'm he him. By the way, just.
Oh, yes.
I've been trying to do that a bit more. It's important.
Yes. And as most of you probably know, I'm RealmW. This is my YouTube channel. Pronouns he, him. So, censorship has been kind of a constant force in games for a very, very long time. The most common, framing device people like to use in terms of early censorship is, of course, the 1993 congressional hearings that also spilled over into 1994 that ultimately resulted in the creation of the ESRB and the industry's kind of self-imposed regulation in that sense. But one of the most pressing issues that was raised by that, and which has kind of continued to exist for a very long time, even with Donald Trump mentioning it just a couple of years ago, is violence in video games. So do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the through lines of discussions about violence and how much, concerns about that have actually been corroborated by evidence?
Yes, I do. Okay, so let me cast your mind back to the forlorn year of 2005, when the American Psychological Association issued a resolution declaring that it would advocate for the reduction of all violence in video games and interactive media marketed to children and youth. Now, even back then, we kind of understood that violence is something that makes video games work really well, because video games are an interactive medium, and if you want to make an action game, violence is something that provides an appropriate enough threat for tension, and also is something that you can easily succeed at in an interactive environment. And a lot of the evidence that the APA was using was linking violent media to hostility and aggressive thoughts, and so forth and so on. But it was widely criticized. So, in 2013, the APA formed a task force on violent media and would try and find out if playing violent video games was linked to actual real-world acts of violence. Then, just 2 years later, in August of 2015, they declared that there is a consistent relation between violent video game use and increases in aggressive behavior, aggressive cognitions, and aggressive affect, and decreases in prosocial behavior, empathy, and sensitivity to aggression. Oh, by the way, before I go on, I want to mention that this is all taken from the blog section of the National Coalition Against Censorship website, and there will be links to that in the description. Okay, so when that was release, when that declaration was put out there, a lot of critics argued that the research didn't support the conclusion. And even Newsweek, which I'm assuming is a big thing in America?
It is, yeah.
Okay, Newsweek even reported that in 2013, a large group of researchers, more than 230, including academics from Harvard, Yale, and Columbia universities, took issue with the APA, the task force, and its research methodology. Excuse me. These researchers then stated in an open letter that the APA's policy statement on violent video games were misleading and alarmist, and said they delineated several strong conclusions on the basis of inconsistent or weak evidence. And this is the kind of deal that comes with violent video games, is that more frequently than not, it gets noticed because of a moral panic. The APA put forward this statement, and it was just kind of that. It was just kind of a moral panic, because a lot of critics pointed out that one of the biggest problems with all of this is how you would define and measure aggression and violence. And they say that the research suggests a correlation between video game playing and actual violence as being very small. Then the APA shoots back with saying that, yeah, the research on taking aspirin to prevent heart disease is also has a small correlation, but doctors advise people to do it anyway. And then this utter mad lad, this absolute unit, Christopher Ferguson of Stetson University, who is a chief critic of the APA, argued that the task force was stacked with researchers who were more inclined to see video games as harmful, and that makes their conclusion unsurprising. Then that was compounded with scandals that arose in, I believe, 2013 surrounding the APA and US government torture practices. And this is a very specific case, but this is kind of where moral panic happens. And now, Realm, do you remember a couple years ago a game called Hatred coming out?
I'm not actually sure I do.
Okay, so on Steam, there was a game called Hatred that came out. It was a one of those like Postal 2 kind of super controversial games. It was about a guy going around his neighborhood just like shooting everything up. It was absolutely disgusting. It made all these super edgy choices, and the reason it did that is because it wasn't doing anything illegal, but it was just controversial enough to get a huge press release about it. Everyone was talking about Hatred for a few months, and that makes people say like, oh, I have to check this game out. And then we have cases like Hot Coffee, where we're bringing up Hot Coffee really quickly. I should have probably saved this for later in the video when we start running out of things to talk about.
We were gonna get there eventually.
But with cases like Hot Coffee, where someone modded GTA, I think San Andreas, to make the sex minigame an actual minigame, and people had a moral panic over it. And I think it was who's that famous video game lawyer? I think I wrote his name down. It wasn't Jack Thompson who was on that case, was it?
I'm not certain. It may have been.
Okay, well, I'm not going to slander Jack Thompson's name if he wasn't on that case. But anyway, a lawyer brought forward a class action lawsuit against Rockstar and who was the people who were publishing them at the time. And they won the class action lawsuit. They got something like $22,000 or something. I don't know the exact amount, but it was a pretty substantial amount of money. And a few years later, it became public knowledge that most of the people who were involved in the class action lawsuit hadn't collected their money yet, which then just, goes to the lawyers. So there's a lot of reasons why moral panic comes about, and there's a lot of reasons why people take advantage of it. And that's kind of the deal here. A lot of censorship happens because moral panic happens, and you have to look at what's happening behind the panic. Is there some shady organization trying to make cash off of this? For the most part, probably. I mean, GTA San Andreas got restricted to mature in America, which puts it alongside like porn games. It got another 18 plus rating in Europe, but in Australia it just got banned.
I believe it actually received an adults only in the United States, which, though it's not technically a ban, it does make it very difficult to actually be commercially viable. So you'll have most developers, if their game is going to end up receiving an adults only from the ESRB, simply opt to revise it to the point where it would be able to be marketed as an M-rated title, because adults only, many different retailers will refuse to carry games that are given that rating. Even certain publishers will refuse to allow it on their platforms.
I mean, like, think about Dead or Alive Beach Volleyball. Like, you'd never see that in a regular game store.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where GTA San Andreas was now, because of this moral panic. And that doesn't mean that the moral panic was unjustified, right? Because the mod for GTA San Andreas didn't do anything except change like a value in the coding that enabled that minigame. So that minigame was there already. They just sort of deleted it. And
yeah,
I mean, I don't necessarily think that means that GTA San Andreas should have been put on this adults only list. I don't think that makes the moral panic, justified. But there is a reason why people do this. That it's not just like super what's the word I'm looking for? Unreasonable people doing all of this to hurt your friend's favorite play machine. There is a reason behind all moral panics, but you have to really look into it to see if it's an actual moral reason, or if the reason is the APA wants to make video games look bad.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with regards to the APA, you raised a very interesting point earlier in the criticism of their work, which is that the kind of standards by which a lot of these things are determined are very subjective, and when you're coming at it from the perspective of a group that kind of appears as if it's already beginning from the point of presuming that there is some kind of correlation, then trying to identify that correlation, you're probably going to end up with the conclusion you set out thinking you're going to find. And on top of that, with determining kind of baselines for what constitutes content that needs to be in some way censored, it's also very kind of subjective. So we have the ESRB in the United States, and Europe as well as Israel has PEGI. Most other countries have specific national review systems that are either usually a function of the government, but in some cases independent. In some cases,
I believe South Africa uses PEGI. I think I would have to check one of my game boxes, but they're kind of out of reach right now. But I believe we use PEGI as well.
That sounds right. And PEGI is actually a very interesting case because it is technically an independent board, but it is also mandated by government in numerous countries. But we have those kinds of systems. In the United States, we've actually had attempts to use other systems. Specifically in California, there was an attempt to outright ban certain games based off of the kind of qualifications the U.S. government already uses to determine what content is obscene. But all of these are a little bit weird and a little bit flawed, and I think that it is important that systems like them exist, even
Yeah, definitely. That these kinds of systems need to exist, otherwise people can just make a game that's 40 hours of hate speech.
Yeah, exactly. And even with the problems the ESRB has, specifically I think the fact that adults only is essentially not commercially viable makes it so that the mature category is vastly too broad. You end up with titles like Halo, which are, ostensibly science fantasy titles alongside things like Grand Theft Auto. And I don't necessarily think that it's great that, for the most part, things can become completely unmarketable if they don't contain hate or whatnot. But these systems should probably exist, but all of them do have some serious flaws. Do you think that? Well, one, do you think that the systems we have are okay as is? Do you think that we could get to a point where we have a system that maximizes the amount of information given to consumers and maximizes the kind of, the good elements of these systems, but keeps it from becoming, in certain ratings on them, from becoming de facto censorship labels?
Well, actually, I think a problem with these systems is that I think they were based on systems used to rate other forms of media. I think video games often get lumped in with things like TV and movies. And I read up on a study that I believe it's Waikato University in New Zealand did, an international study, where the doctor in charge, his research revealed differences in the impacts between the viewed experience and the played experience for video games. So what that means is basically if you're playing a game, you might be so focused on it that something that should make you flinch won't even affect you because you're too busy thinking about what you should be doing. But if you're watching the game, that thing will make you flinch. And this doctor stated that he believes that a lot of video game classification systems are based on film classifications that consider the viewed experience only. And that makes a lot of sense because, I mean, if you take, for instance, Halo is a mature game, technically, and so is Grand Theft Auto. They have vastly different played experiences. I mean, if you're looking at them, they're both games about shooting people. But when you're playing them, Halo feels like a Saturday morning cartoon with an operatic soundtrack. And Grand Theft Auto feels like a Saturday morning cartoon written by Adult Swim.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I know at very least the ESRB was specifically modeled after film rating systems that we already had in the United States. I believe that the senators who were on that committee for the congressional hearings even said that it was better than those systems. And I think that maybe in terms of specificity, it might be. However, I think that that's a super interesting point, is that, video games are very different kinds of media from television or film. And they do have this entirely separate dimension of interaction that the viewer, or in this case, obviously, the player, can have with it, which is on its own something that really significantly influences the way that content is experienced.
Definitely. And some of these systems aren't even fair to each other. I mean, if you look at Australia, for instance, The recent, I think it's like an expansion of, what's the game? Disco Elysium. Came out, and they wanted to start putting it on consoles in Australia, but when they do that, it has to go through the classification board. Now, something that's weird about Australia is that the consumption of drugs is allowed in other forms of media like TV and movies, but is banned in video games. So you have a game like Disco Elysium where one of the main story beats is that your character's kind of a drug addict, and he takes drugs and gets benefits from it, but in the long term he gets detriments, which is a fairly succinct metaphor. Well, not even a metaphor, it's a succinct way to describe drugs. So the thing is that Disco Elysium depicts drug usage pretty accurately. I mean, obviously not super accurately. Taking speed won't make you literally run faster, but it depicts drug usage as something that gives you like a small benefit right now and then a huge detriment in the long run. And movies and TV shows frequently don't depict drug usage very well, but they're still allowed to do it in Australia when games get banned for that kind of thing.
That's very fascinating. Well, just out of curiosity, do you know if that ban includes like fictionalized drugs that are, ostensibly drugs, but are kind of, my mind goes specifically to Skyrim. I believe.
Oh,
that
like
has
skooma.
Yeah.
I don't know if it applies to fictional drugs. No.
Okay.
But
yeah.
I will say this: you can still play Disco Elysium in Australia on Steam, because Steam isn't set for the it doesn't have to go through the classification board. It's just console versions.
That's very interesting. And
Yeah.
you did bring up a really great point there, which is that specifically with things like drugs, video games have the ability, in a way that other kinds of media don't, to actually avoid glamorizing them and avoid depicting them as kind of this, glamorous but kind of distant from the viewer thing. Whereas, as you described in Disco Elysium, you actually are able to depict the kind of harsh realities of things like that. And you do, like, video games provide, in a lot of ways, a means of avoiding a lot of the pitfalls that something which is a purely passive media can fall into.
It's so useful as just a tool, like I recall when a class in America used Second Life to go on a field trip. And I actually mentioned that in an academic paper I wrote in university when I was studying for my education degree. And that was, like, everyone thought that was mind-blowing. And that's the thing, is that no one thinks of video games as an interactive medium, except for people who play video games. Everyone thinks it's like the new book or the new movie or whatever, but it's not. It can reach places that those mediums can't, because you actually have to, have input. What was that word? You have to have input in where the story goes and what happens to your character and whatever. And I think we need a classification that reflects that. Because, yeah, maybe it does need to be a bit stricter in certain cases when it's literally forcing you to do something horrendous. Like Manhunter was a super violent video game, and that deserves a hectic classification that, puts it in its own category of this game will teach you how to murder people. But if it's a game like, I don't know, Stardew Valley, then there definitely does need to be more leniency.
Yeah, absolutely. Describing it as something that is vastly more different than vastly more separate from other kinds of media than, say, books are from film or from television, or the interactive element really does distinguish it much more than a lot of people think. And hopefully maybe as video games are naturally already have become this monolithic industry, they aren't going anywhere. I do
Except
have some
straight into the ground thanks to big businesses. Ugh.
Yeah.
Support your indie artists, folks.
Exactly. I do think, though, one of the more interesting aspects of censorship in games, and particularly in the United States, though this is, I think, naturally a thing elsewhere, is the discussions that surround it, and specifically how, I believe, with Gamergate, over the past, dear God, nearly 7 years now, discussions about censorship have actually, I believe, shifted away, at least in the mainstream, from more meaningful resistance to attempts at censorship on a federal level here, but, more generally just against the censorship of games when being localized, to, as all things, as all roads lead to in Gamergate, the SJWs, and the anxiety that what is ostensibly social shifts constitutes a degree of censorship. And I think that this came kind of to a head within the last several years in 2019 with Mortal Kombat 11, and the fact that numerous characters in that title were a lot more covered up, so to speak, than they had been in previous games. As we all know, Mortal Kombat is like a series that very highly sexualizes its female characters, always has. But they decided to move away from that, and people were pissed.
Yeah, the incels threw a hissy.
Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting, obviously that's one of those instances where, these people are being absurd. But I think it does raise some interesting questions about what we actually consider to be censorship, and whether we consider those kinds of self-censorship to actually count. Personally, I think that is censorship, really, because we engage in that kind of self-censorship every day because of cultural norms or social expectations. We do that kind of thing all the time. That is censorship. But I don't really necessarily think that, censorship, if we're going to define it in those terms, necessarily means something is objectionable.
Well, you see, I disagree with you there. I don't think it's censorship to change the designs of characters. I mean, yeah, the designs of characters were changed because they wanted to move away from over-sexualizing their female characters. But it is also far and apart their choice to do that. It's not censorship if you're just not giving fans what they want. Censorship is what affects the artist, I think, mostly.
Oh, for sure.
It would be like if they had to change the character designs because the ESRB told them to, then it would be censorship. But for me, it's just them moving in a different direction.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I do agree that the element here that makes it, at least in my opinion, that does kind of make it a form of censorship is not the fact that, a bunch of incels got pissy about it. And again, I would like to make very clear that I think that this was a perfectly acceptable decision to make.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And it was absolutely their prerogative. However, I think that, censorship can happen not just because it's been mandated, but because of pressure. And when it comes to pressures, one of the more interesting ones that isn't always considered is social pressure. And it's undeniable that in terms of where culture has gone in the past decade, and specifically where games culture has gone within the past decade, because when Gamergate is discussed, it's always discussed in terms of the resistance, so to speak, the kind of wave of white dudes sitting in front of piles of action figures yelling at a camera, but it's not always discussed in terms of the kind of wave that precipitated it, which was more socially progressive and conscious criticism of games. And so I think that, that changed the cultural climate a lot, to the point where there might have been some degree of pressure. But I will actually concede that it's not necessarily pressure in that case. It could have also been, and I think it was in large part, the fact that those critics got the conversation to the point where it was okay enough for Mortal Kombat to make that kind of a decision. Because a very... Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you're good. A very interesting thing we actually saw recently, it was last year specifically, that essentially Ubisoft said that they had thought about making the protagonist of the next Assassin's Creed title female only. I believe in the actual game you could choose between a male or a female protagonist.
That's Valhalla, right?
I believe it was Odyssey, actually.
Oh, yeah, no, you could choose between male and female. And they sold that like it was a new thing. It's not a new thing. Assassin's Creed did that already as a series, like 2 games before.
Yeah, it's not a new thing by any means. But one of the interesting... the reason they said for that was because female protagonists don't sell. Which I thought that was very interesting because a lot of the people who are very quick to jump on the idea that Mortal Kombat 11, that situation was some sort of terrible censorship, interestingly are not super ready to condemn the Ubisoft for basically bending the knee to what amounts to self-censorship induced by
Sexism.
Gamer culture.
It's just like you have to wonder to yourself if anyone at Ubisoft has played Tomb Raider.
Yeah.
Because, yes, female protagonists do sell. If they're not selling, I don't think you're selling them right.
Yeah, I think that definitely plays a major role. And it is
let me hit you with 2 points here.
Okay.
So I watched a video recently by a YouTuber called Sarah Z on podcasting, or about a specific group of podcasters, and it introduced the idea of a parasocial relationship. Now, what a parasocial relationship is, for anyone who's listening and doesn't know, is a relationship you have with someone who's very one-sided, not because they don't like you or anything, or because it's unrequited, but because they don't know you exist. So that's the kind of relationship like fans have with their icons. And I think that a lot of the times in gaming culture, people get that kind of parasocial relationship not necessarily with developers or with coders or anything, but with the games themselves. That they develop this kind of bond to this game, and then because most people don't read the credits or know exactly who made this or whatever, they grow a bond to the company. And so they jump on these things, because a parasocial relationship can result in 2 things, especially if you've got an online presence. Either these people will jump to defend you about anything and be incredibly hostile and rabid because they think that someone is attacking their friend, and in an extension, attacking them. And the other one is that they will turn on you the second you don't do something that they like. And that's where the gaming industry has been for years now. I mean, take a look at Dragon Age. Dragon Age 2. One of the head writers, she got sent so many death threats because fans didn't like how she wrote a video game. And that's not even unusual for gaming. I mean, take a look at Phil Fish and everyone else who left the gaming industry because just how toxic the community gets with them if they do something that they don't like. Because that's where we're at right now.
Yeah, exactly. And we saw this exact process, like both sides of that coin, the rabid defense and the kind of vitriolic hatred, happen in real time with CD Projekt Red with the release of Cyberpunk 2077. The difference in culture before and after the release of that game is astounding. Because it really would be that if you kind of implied that you were like not super you weren't really anticipating Cyberpunk, or you were kind of had reservations about how it was going to turn out, that, you know, you were dogpiled. Like CD Projekt Red, you know, they made The Witcher 3. This is like this godlike entity, and they have what's best for me and for games in mind. But that game came out, as everyone knows, and it was, you know, I haven't, I haven't played it, so I'm not gonna make a judgment on how it actually was, but
I have,
you know, it
it.
undeniably
It was hot garbage.
it undeniably fell vastly
from,
short.
You know that scene from Spy Kids with the finger people?
It's been a very long time since I've seen Spy Kids.
Okay, so in Spy Kids, there are these people who are like finger people. They all look like thumbs. That's what the models look like in the game for most of the time I was playing.
Oh god,
because the textures would just drop.
Yeah. You know, some would say there's an art to it, but
I mean, no. Yeah. Some would say that those people need eye surgery desperately.
Oh well. But yeah, it fell vastly short, and suddenly all of these exact same people who were, you know, rushing to their defense were the ones sending them death threats and, you know, just being incredibly personally hurt by the fact that they had developed this very personal investment in the game and the company itself, and then immediately and vitriolically turned on them. And I think you're very right to connect this to the ways that specifically the anti-SJW movement has operated with regards to censorship. And I think Thought Slime did a very good video about this, where they kind of equated the anti-SJW ideology to being kind of fascistic in its development of these very personal and fundamental to one's identity connections to the ways that, you know, media you liked used to be, the way Mortal Kombat was when it was good, you know.
Yes, that's a term that gets thrown around a lot, when it was good. And I just want to quickly throw in this my second point, now that you brought up the anti-SJW movement. Keeping in mind this idea of parasocial relationships, I think a lot of people confuse open and honest discussion with calling someone out. You know, like discussing that, oh, hey, you know, it's a bit weird that they're censoring Mortal Kombat now, and people just sort of jump on that and immediately say like, oh, but they're doing this because of SJWs, or they're doing it because they're over-sexualizing people, and they just, you know, throw it around and it becomes an argument rather than a discussion. Because from that discussion, we could have gleaned some points as to whether people thought that Who makes Mortal Kombat?
NetherRealm.
That are NetherRealm doing this because they want to move away from over-sexualizing their characters, or is this performative? And what a perfect month to be recording this in, to talk about whether or not a business is being performative.
Yes.
Happy Pride, everyone.
Happy Pride. And I think that's a great point. And I do believe that framing our positions and our conversations around what anti-feminists and anti-SJWs want conversations to be, and basically ending up with our positions being ones that simply exist to be in opposition of theirs, damages our ability to have, you know, just nuanced discussions about the actual nature of what's occurring here, which is not ideal, I think, especially when we're dealing with these massive multi-billion-dollar corporations that, you know, like it or not, we often end up on their side. And sometimes I think that's justified to some degree, but also, you know, I do think that allowing these discussions and the parameters to be framed by people who are pretty fundamentally dishonest is not great for us.
But look, okay, let's take a step back here for a second. Neither of us is saying now that you have to enter into an open and honest discussion with racists and sexists and bigots and whatever. Because, I mean, I am not a woman, and I have never lived in the world as a woman, and therefore I've never had to experience a lot of the issues that come with being in a very misogynistic world as a woman. I'm also white, so I've never had to go through anything that people of color go through on a daily basis because of how the system is stacked against them. So I'm not going to start saying, you know, we should open up a discourse with these people who are yelling things at you because of the way you were born. As if it was some sort of, like, mistake you made. No, we're not saying that. It's just that certain of these groups form these parasocial relationships with specific pieces of media, and then start attacking the creators of those pieces of media based on those relationships. And I think in a large part how that fits into the full story of what we're talking about here today is that people see stuff like that and they have no idea what's going on in the gaming industry, and they start thinking that this is because games are leading people to do this. But as we've just proven here, these groups are doing this regardless. This isn't necessarily about games. It's not like the only pissing matches people have online are because their favorite game got censored. This happens all the time in basically every community. I would put good money on saying that there are probably people in bird-watching groups on Facebook who have toxic conversations with bigots in their chats. But it gets put on games that this is what they're leading people to be like, and so moral panics arise and classifications on games get more severe, and then you start lumping in games like Halo, or man, I've got Halo on my brain. I've played more games than Halo, I promise. You start lumping in games like Assassin's Creed with games like Manhunter, where yes, technically they're both about killing people, but Assassin's Creed is kind of a far more toned down version of that, whereas Manhunter is about literally hunting men.
I think you're it's very important that you mentioned that. It's very interesting because I think a lot of people bring this up and kind of raise the question of if so many elements of the games industry are so fundamentally would lead somebody to being interested in leftist ideology. Just the abhorrent labor practices, the incredible anti-consumer tendencies of the industry, especially recently, why does it end up that all of these people are so right-wing? And I think that it is also then easy to say that that's because of the way games are. I think games are the way they are because of the people who play them. And that's what we saw with Ubisoft, that the culture of games has developed somewhat independently of the games themselves, that the culture of games is the culture of these specific subsets of games communities has become fundamentally right-wing on its own, and it's beyond games. You know, all of these people a lot of the times engage in lots of other kinds of media spaces online, and what's happened is that they've developed this monolith that then ends up forming the ways that games are made, the ways that games are marketed, and the things that are depicted therein. And, you know, end up kind of, at least in some cases, doing the kind of damage that they think SJWs are actually doing to the industry.
I mean, yeah, definitely. I totally agree with you that games are almost like crowdfunded isn't the right word, but like audience made.
Mm-hmm.
Where the influences of people, and that's the thing, is nerd culture is fairly inherently right-wing for the most part. It started off like that, and it's kind of slowly moving towards more of a central ground between left and right now, but there's still so much about it that is right-wing, because, and I've said this on other videos before, that nerds have this almost like martyr complex when it comes to their exclusion from quote-unquote normal society, and they revel in video games because it lets them feel powerful and strong and whatever, and they don't want that to change, and so they kind of gatekeep it, and because of that we don't progress into a better system. People aren't going to start making more progressive games if there's no incentive that they're going to sell.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and that's it's the case with pretty much any kind of popular media that, you know, that is formed by the culture it exists in and has to be marketed to. You're not going to end up with pieces of media, for the most part, that are created for mass market that are going to fundamentally challenge the ideology of the people who are meant to be consuming that media.
Exactly. No one is promoting feminist memoirs to Star Trek conventions.
Yeah.
Man, I'm slamming nerds tonight. I don't even care. Come at me. Tweet me about this. But
Byte Marx cast.
At Byte Marx cast on Twitter. But yeah, I think it's almost an interesting microcosm in and of itself of companies putting products into the gaming environment and then into the gaming community, and then the gaming community almost twisting them and putting them back onto companies. Because, like, let's go back to CD Projekt Red for a minute. The Witcher 3 was enormously successful. It was so brilliantly successful, and that's why Assassin's Creed changed into a Witcher 3 like system. You know, and that was done because they wanted to capture a different audience, and a lot of people from their audience didn't like that, and some people did like that, and some people got really into it. But as you follow Assassin's Creed, it becomes more and more cookie cutter as it goes along. It literally hits every point that has been successful in a previous game. Like, I played Origins recently. It took about 10 minutes for us to get into the family member was killed, I'm on revenge plot now. And that's the thing. That happened in 2. And then we've got gameplay from Assassin's Creed. We got gameplay from The Witcher 3. And we've got boats Kombat from Black Flag. And it's literally just trying to, like, Frankenstein all of the successful parts of itself into one game. And I don't know when the censorship video turned onto a slam on Assassin's Creed, but here we are.
Here we are. But no, and I think that it does kind of bring us full circle a little bit, though, because in talking about how, one, games culture dictates the way games are made, and how the markets and these kinds of necessities that you have to fulfill when you're trying to market video games to gamers, and in the modern market that make you do things like what has happened to Assassin's Creed. We saw it with the every couple of years there is some new trend that everyone has to jump on. A couple of years ago it was the Battle Royale. A couple of years before that it was the open world game. These market forces are ultimately what dictate what happens in the industry. And one of the most powerful market forces that dictates what kind of content ends up in games traditionally, what kinds of ideas games are able to discuss, what kinds of, people are able to be depicted in games, and what kinds of things games talk about, has been the right-wing gamer culture. And if Ubisoft is kind of thinking about including something like an exclusively female main character, but are not really willing to do it because they're concerned about, how that will be marketable, how that will sell. We saw things like Battlefield 5, it did sell poorly, and I don't think that is attributable to representation, but people can get concerned about gamers getting mad about shit, and that will lead to these companies kind of placing this small, even if it is in minor ways, this little bit of self-censorship on themselves. And if Ubisoft is basically saying they've done it, then I think it's kind of impossible to believe that other corporations aren't doing it as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm not about to start defending Ubisoft because they're gross. But I will say that it is well within a company's I suppose rights is the word. I was looking for a fancier word, but rights will do. It's well within a company's rights to decide what to not put in their game. Mm-hmm. And that decision is up to them, but that decision is affected by what their fans are going to do if they do put that thing in their game.
Yeah, for sure. And no, I'm not trying to suggest in any way that, self-censorship, that's a thing all of us do every day in social interactions and all kinds of contexts, that we have pressures on us from, social understandings or whatever.
Yeah, it's that little voice in your head that says, don't say that, that's going to be taken horribly poorly. Yeah, well, hopefully it doesn't say that because that's terrible grammar, but you get the point.
No, for sure. And these companies are totally within their rights to do it. Like, in the case of, NetherRealm, they were absolutely within their rights to do that, and naturally, as is Ubisoft. But that ultimately, when it boils down to it, that is a little form of censorship. And I don't, again, necessarily think that means it's bad, because I think that, we often kind of get into the idea that, we both have a very broad understanding of what constitutes censorship, especially with gamers. Like, the Mortal Kombat 11, that, everyone was really on that for being censorship. And, I'm honestly willing to be generous and basically say, yeah, sure, that is. But, if we're going to have a definition of censorship that's so broad as to include these kinds of self-censorships, quote unquote, that, are just decisions effectively, then you can't really also have the belief that censorship is a scary word that is always something evil and bad,
Yeah, I don't think this is a black and white situation. I don't think it's censorship is always good or always bad. I think it's a far more nuanced issue where censorship is definitely fine in some cases and important in other cases, and can be seen as in and of itself being offensive in certain cases. Like if you were to print a history book with all of the bad stuff white people did to black people over the years taken out of it as censorship because you don't want to trigger anyone, that is in and of itself more offensive than just leaving that stuff in, because that's historical revisionism. You are rewriting history to make everything look better.
Yeah, and actually to that point, I saw a really interesting video while kind of researching for this, that it basically was making the argument that, the implicit understanding, I guess, that censorship is an inherently bad thing and that its implication in kind of any context is an inherently negative thing. But within that video, they brought up the fact that Birth of a Nation, like one of the most horrible works created in American history, just this immensely hateful, detestable film that, glorified the KKK, directly precipitated a massive jump in their membership, that had been, in some cases, censored, and that even in terms of the leveraging of state governments or laws to try and get that censored happened by certain progressive groups. But the video didn't really even interrogate the kind of implications of that or think about the fact that that's a really interesting case, and that, like, I think most people could agree that it's not a black and white situation, especially there. That is an incredibly hateful piece of art, in quotations, I guess, an incredibly hateful work.
Yeah.
That there's a very strong argument, I think, to be made that it should be possible to kind of prohibit that its distribution. Now, some people would say that yeah, you should be able to do that, but you shouldn't implicate the government. That's a slippery slope. I'm not really going to make a, definitive statement on that, but it's a very complicated issue. And, to bring up something like that and then to not even discuss at all how that kind of complicates the discussions that we have, I think it kind of represents a lot of what these discussions have become, which is just, trying to dunk on people who, either it's the people precipitating moral panic, who, again, like, it's bad, but, there are more nuanced discussions here to have than this person is wrong and stupid, I win, bye-bye.
Yeah, that not similar, but in a similar vein, sort of situation happened in South Africa a few years ago, where people were protesting certain statues because they were statues of colonists that came and colonized these areas. Like at Rhodes University, there was a statue of Cecil John Rhodes, who was a massive colonist and slave owner and generally terrible human being, and people want his statue to be removed. And a lot of people said, no, but if you do that, we're going against our own history. And we need to keep it there. And it's a very silly argument if you think about it. Like, we need to make sure that there are still monuments to these awful people so that we can preserve our history, as if there aren't like history books written about these people.
as if we learn our history from statues.
But like the seemingly middle ground option here was to remove the statues and put them into storage or in museums or something. and just remove them from the public eye, and maybe put someone up who, I don't know, fought for the emancipation of this country instead. But it just became this huge pissing match between people who thought they were right on either side. And there were more reasonable arguments on the side of people who wanted the statues to be taken down. In my opinion, that was the correct side. But it became this whole thing of, instead of doing anything, the story became about the arguments between these people rather than what should be done about the statues. And that's kind of where, these situations are at. I agree that you can't censor history, what happened in media, in movies and books and games. You can't censor what actually happened in history, but you also don't have to celebrate it.
Yeah, and the fact that I think it just needs to be understood that recontextualization is not censorship, and the fact that not all depictions of things are neutral. That statues, to that example, are an inherently valorizing symbol that, we believe that this person is significant enough, and at least specifically within our cultures, we understand statues as being of somebody good enough and, notable and worthy of being admired to such a degree that we're going to build a statue of them and put it into a public space. And acting as if that is somehow a neutral depiction, which demonstrates history, I think is a little bit absurd. But yeah, absolutely. To putting them in museums or whatnot, to be honest, again, we don't really learn history from statues. I think in the context of them being removed, placing them into museums, with reference to the specific circumstances under which they were removed, and the kind of social changes that were occurring when it happened, is fine. But, we simply don't need them. And I don't believe that that's censorship.
Oh, yeah, no, I think we should have just, melted them down or whatever.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The ideal... Yeah.
Today we tore down the statue, and all I got was this coin. That would have been great.
Yeah.
Medallions or whatever. We could have just melted down the statue, but what I'm saying is that the discourse there stopped being about should we remove this statue or not, and became about who is correct, the side that wants to remove the statue or the side that doesn't. And that sounds the same, but it's really not.
No,
because
it's not. That's
it ends
a very
up being
important...
this, fractal discourse about discourse.
That's a very important distinction to make. In that I do actually think that, I'm not sure if this is exactly to what you're saying, but that what's kind of happened is that, for one, yeah, it's kind of become discourse about discourse, and also recently discussions about censorship have moved away from being about censorship itself, and I think to the detriment of the conversations, that we have lost a bit actually discussing how it occurs in the industry today, and it's become kind of a proxy war for the culture war, the broader culture war. And again, yeah, you're right, it's not necessarily about what should actually be done with regards to censorship. It's about whose side is ideologically correct.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to hit you with a couple of questions just to sort of summarize this for the people who skip to the end.
Yes.
What is censorship?
I believe personally that censorship is basically any kind of limitation of speech or expression made based on pressures. The pressures could be more limited, like just, I don't want to make this person feel bad if I said something kind of mean about them, or it could be much more strong, like actual government mandate.
Okay, do you think that the current system of video game censorship works, or can it be improved?
I think it is very flawed, and I think that the point we discussed specifically about how video games are a very fundamentally different media from the other kinds of media that its systems are based off of is a very good point, and that the ESRB as it functions currently is a theoretically good system that is okay, but that ultimately ends up not being great, especially with distinctions between games that have quote-unquote mature content.
Oh, I also want to throw in here, because we didn't mention it and I just thought of it. I was thinking of saying we should just get one system for the whole world. Like, it shouldn't be ESRB, PEGI, and whatever Australia uses. But really thinking about that, that's impossible, isn't it? Because the culture in America is so different from everywhere else.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that it kind of differs to such a degree that one uniform rating system wouldn't really work. To a degree, though, like, every rating system is roughly analogous to a lot of the other ones that you can kind
Except
of
in
basically
Australia,
convert.
apparently.
Except there, yeah. But I do think that the cultural differences are a little bit insurmountable insofar as creating a uniform worldwide system would go.
Okay, and finally, do you think that censorship can be a good thing?
I think that censorship in some cases can be a good thing. I think in some cases it can be a bad thing. But I also think that it can be much more of a neutral thing. It can be a more morally neutral action a lot of the time, which, is kind of a cop-out answer. But, as we discussed, it does become very nuanced. And in cases, even when you're censoring something immensely hateful, the question about, but what kind of precedent does this set? I kind of think that being what kind of precedent does this set guy is a little bit obnoxious sometimes. But, there are reasonable questions raised.
It's like those comedians who get called out for being offensive, and then they blame woke culture for not getting jobs.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I do kind of really want to shy away from being the guy who's like, oh my god, what kind of precedent are you setting? But, in some cases, especially when you're getting the government itself involved, and when your government, also hasn't had a super great track record of being very friendly to, leftist voices and pieces of leftist media, people can get kind of concerned. I tend to get less so, but, I can see where people come from there.
Well, there you have it, folks. We just solved censorship.
It's done. Everyone,
Boom.
share this
Fixed.
video with your friends, family, co-workers, and tell them about the good news.
No, don't tell them. But that's a thing already. Tell them about the great news.
The best news.
The best news, which is us solving censorship.
Exactly. Well, I think we really got a lot done here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on. This was really
thank
excellent.
you for having me.
Do you want to just plug your social media one more time?
Sure thing. I am from Byte Marx. You can find us on YouTube, on Twitter at Byte Marx Cast, on Instagram. I believe is also at Byte Marx Cast. I haven't checked recently. We're not that active on Instagram yet, but hey, if we get a couple more followers, who knows? Also, if you'd like to support my channel specifically, you can go to the Byte Marx Patreon, and if you're not ready for that kind of commitment, you can buy us a coffee. But the one thing I really do want to plug is our Curious Cat. We're planning on doing a 500 subscribers special Q&A, and we're looking for some new questions. So if you have any questions you want to ask me or Emilio, if you've seen our work, then feel free to shoot at us at the Byte Marx Curious Cat, which the links are on our channel.
And I will also have them in the description.
Brilliant.
Do you have any parting comments?
Do you think that there was a penguin that drowned once, and all of the other penguins couldn't figure it out, and then the right-wing penguins try to blame it on gay penguins as like a conspiracy to attempt to ban gay penguin marriage?
I think it's very possible, but I also do like to believe that penguins live in a kind of gay utopia.
Yeah, I think I would like to believe that penguins subscribe to gay space communism.
Yes.
Okay, and let's leave you on that thought. Penguin gay space communism.
Penguins will inherit the Earth, and they will do better than we did.
Yeah, I mean,
thank you, everyone.
They couldn't do worse.
Yeah, I doubt it. All right.
Well, thank you for watching.
Yep. Thank you for watching, everyone.
Happy
Bye.
Pride.
Yes, happy Pride.
Goodbye.